The morning rain drummed against the windows of Martinez's auto repair shop as Carlos wiped his hands on an oil-stained rag. At 35, he had been fixing cars for nearly 2 decades, following in his father's footsteps. The small garage barely made enough money to cover rent, but Carlos loved the honest work of bringing broken things back to life. His phone buzzed with another overdue bill notice, but he ignored it. Money had always been tight since his wife Maria was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis 3 years ago. Between her medical bills and their young daughter Sophia's school expenses, every dollar counted. Yet Carlos never complained. He believed that hard work and kindness would somehow see them through the difficult times. The bell above the shop door chimed as Mrs. Henderson, his elderly neighbor, struggled to push her manual wheelchair through the entrance. The 78-year-old woman had been coming to Carlos for small repairs ever since her late husband's old Buick finally gave up. But today she wasn't bringing a car problem. "Carlos, dear, I hate to bother you," she said, breathing heavily from the effort of maneuvering the wheelchair, "but this old thing is acting up again. The left wheel keeps locking up and I can barely move it." Carlos immediately set down his tools and walked over to examine the wheelchair. The brake mechanism was indeed sticking, and one of the wheels had accumulated debris in its bearings. It would be an easy fix, but he knew Mrs. Henderson lived on a fixed Social Security income. "Don't you worry about it," Carlos said with a warm smile. "Let me take a look." He carefully helped Mrs. Henderson into a folding chair and began examining the wheelchair more closely. The device was old and worn, probably from the 1990s. Several screws were loose, the armrests were cracked, and the seat cushion was compressed flat from years of use. This wasn't just a quick brake adjustment. The entire wheelchair needed significant repairs. "Mrs. Henderson, how long have you been using this wheelchair?" Carlos asked, running his fingers along the bent frame. "Oh, about 15 years now," she replied, adjusting her glasses. "It belonged to my sister before she passed. I know it's not much to look at, but it's all I can afford." Carlos felt his heart sink. He knew that a new wheelchair could cost thousands of dollars, money that neither he nor Mrs. Henderson had. But looking at this frail woman who had always been kind to his family, who had brought Sophia cookies when she was sick, and had never missed asking about Maria's condition, he couldn't just send her away. "Tell you what," Carlos said, making a decision that would change everything. "Why don't you leave this with me for the weekend? I'll see what I can do to get it running properly." Mrs. Henderson's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, Carlos, I can't pay much. Maybe $20? "We'll worry about payment later," Carlos assured her. "Right now, let's focus on getting you mobile again." After Mrs. Henderson left in her son's car, Carlos spent the rest of the day thinking about the wheelchair. That evening, he spread the components across his garage floor at home, determining what parts could be salvaged and what needed replacement. The brake cables were frayed, the wheel bearings were shot, and the entire frame needed realignment. Maria watched from the doorway as Carlos sketched out his repair plan. "You know we can't afford new parts right now," she said gently. "I know," Carlos replied, not looking up from his work. "But maybe I can find some used parts or fabricate something that works." "You have such a good heart," Maria said, rolling her own wheelchair closer to give him a kiss on the forehead. "That's why I fell in love with you." The next morning, Carlos drove to 3 different medical supply stores, looking for affordable replacement parts. Everything was expensive. A simple brake cable cost $40, and new wheel bearings were $60 each. By the end of the day, he had spent nearly $200 of their grocery money on parts, telling himself that somehow they would make it work. He worked through the weekend, staying up late in his garage with a single work light, carefully rebuilding the wheelchair from the ground up. He straightened the frame using his automotive tools, installed new bearings, replaced all the cables, and even welded a small crack in the footrest support. But Carlos went further than just making repairs. He noticed that the wheelchair seat was uncomfortably low, and the armrests were positioned awkwardly. Using his knowledge of ergonomics from car seat adjustments, he modified the chair to provide better support and comfort. He even added small improvements like a cup holder fashioned from spare automotive parts and a small storage pouch made from vinyl scraps. By Sunday evening, the wheelchair looked almost new. Carlos had painted the frame with leftover automotive paint, giving it a deep blue finish that gleamed under the garage lights. The wheels rolled smoothly, the brakes engaged perfectly, and all the adjustments worked like they were supposed to. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching Carlos's mood as he worried about how he would explain to Maria that he had spent their food money on the repair. But when Mrs. Henderson arrived to pick up her wheelchair, her reaction made every penny worth it. "Oh my goodness," she gasped, covering her mouth with both hands. "Carlos, this can't be the same wheelchair." She carefully settled into the seat and immediately noticed the improved comfort and positioning. The chair rolled effortlessly across the garage floor and every feature worked perfectly. "How much do I owe you?" she asked, reaching for her purse. $20. "Just like you said," Carlos replied, though he had spent 10 times that amount. Mrs. Henderson handed him the $20 bill, but Carlos could see tears forming in her eyes. He had no idea that this simple act of kindness would soon transform his life in ways he could never imagine. 2 weeks passed before Carlos saw Mrs. Henderson again. He had been struggling with the financial aftermath of his generous repair job, having to explain to Maria why their grocery budget was so tight that month. She had been understanding, as always, but Carlos could see the worry in her eyes when she calculated their remaining bills. The garage had been unusually quiet that Tuesday afternoon when Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway. But this time she wasn't alone. A tall, well-dressed woman in her 40s accompanied her, along with a younger man carrying a leather briefcase and a tablet. "Carlos," Mrs. Henderson called out cheerfully, rolling smoothly into the shop in her repaired wheelchair. "I want you to meet my niece, Elizabeth." The woman named Elizabeth stepped forward with a professional smile. She was wearing an expensive-looking navy blue suit and carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to boardrooms. Her dark hair was pulled back in an elegant bun, and her jewelry looked like it cost more than Carlos made in a month. "Mr. Martinez," Elizabeth said, extending her hand. "I'm Elizabeth Chen. My aunt has told me so much about what you did for her." Carlos wiped his hands on his coveralls before shaking her hand, feeling self-conscious about the grease stains and worn fabric. "It was nothing special, just fixing what was broken." "Actually, it was quite special," Elizabeth replied, her eyes scanning the modest garage. "My aunt hasn't stopped talking about your kindness. She says you completely rebuilt her wheelchair and only charged her $20. Mrs. Henderson beamed from her wheelchair. "Elizabeth, show him how smooth this thing runs now. It's better than when my sister first got it." The young man with the briefcase had been quietly observing the wheelchair, taking notes on his tablet. He knelt down and began examining Carlos's modifications with obvious interest. "This is remarkable work," he said, looking up at Carlos. "The ergonomic adjustments, the reinforcement welding, the custom modifications. Did you design these improvements yourself?" Carlos felt increasingly uncomfortable with the attention. "I just noticed some things that could work better. I fix cars all day, so I understand how things move and wear out." Elizabeth exchanged a meaningful glance with the young man. "Mr. Martinez, I work in product development. My aunt's description of your improvements caught my attention from a business perspective." "What kind of business?" Carlos asked, though he was beginning to suspect this wasn't just a social visit. "I run a small company that makes medical equipment," Elizabeth said carefully. "We're always looking for innovative solutions to common problems." The truth was far more complex than Elizabeth was letting on, but she had learned long ago to downplay her success when meeting new people. Too often people changed their behavior dramatically once they learned about her wealth, becoming either overly obsequious or suspicious of her motives. Mrs. Henderson had no idea that her niece Elizabeth was actually Elizabeth Chen, founder and CEO of MedTech Innovations, a company worth over $2 billion. Elizabeth had built her empire by identifying simple solutions to complex medical problems, and she had an eye for spotting talent in unexpected places. "Would you mind if my colleague here takes some photos of your modifications?" Elizabeth asked. "For our research purposes?" Carlos shrugged, not seeing any harm in it. The young man, who introduced himself as David, spent the next 20 minutes documenting every detail of Carlos's work. He photographed the welding joints, the ergonomic adjustments, the custom cup holder, and the reinforcement modifications. "Mr. Martinez," David said as he finished his documentation, "have you ever considered that these improvements could help other wheelchair users?" "I guess so," Carlos replied. "But I'm not a medical equipment designer. I just fix things." Elizabeth stepped closer, her business instincts fully engaged. Sometimes the best innovations come from people who approach problems differently. You saw needs that trained designers might miss. Mrs. Henderson watched the conversation with growing excitement. Carlos, are you telling me that my wheelchair could help other people? Potentially, Elizabeth said. Mr. Martinez, would you be open to discussing this further? Perhaps over dinner? My treat, of course, Carlos hesitated. He had promised Maria he would be home early to help with Sophia's homework, and he still had 2 cars to finish before closing time. I appreciate the offer, but I have work to finish and family obligations. Of course, Elizabeth said, pulling a business card from her purse. Here's my contact information. Would you be available to meet this weekend? I think you might find our conversation mutually beneficial. Carlos accepted the card without really looking at it. I suppose I could spare an hour on Saturday morning. Perfect, Elizabeth smiled. There's a coffee shop called Riverside Cafe on 5th Street. Would 9 o'clock work for you? After they left, Carlos glanced at the business card. It was elegantly simple, with just Elizabeth's name and phone number. No company logo, no job title, nothing that would indicate she was anything more than someone interested in wheelchair design. That evening at dinner, Carlos mentioned the encounter to Maria and Sophia. This woman wants to talk to me about Mrs. Henderson's wheelchair. She says she works in medical equipment. Maybe she wants to hire you to fix more wheelchairs, Sophia suggested, her 8-year-old mind seeing the possibility for additional income. Maria smiled at their daughter's optimism. It's nice that people notice your good work, Carlos. Maybe something positive will come of it. Carlos wasn't holding his breath. In his experience, business people made big promises and delivered small results. But Mrs. Henderson seemed genuinely excited about the meeting, and it couldn't hurt to listen to what Elizabeth had to say. As he prepared for bed that night, Carlos reflected on how strange it was that a simple act of kindness had attracted so much attention. He had fixed the wheelchair because it was the right thing to do, not because he expected anything in return. The idea that his modifications might actually be valuable enough for someone to want to discuss business seemed almost too good to be true. He had no way of knowing that Elizabeth Chen had spent the entire evening researching his background, impressed not just by his technical skills but by his character. She had built her fortune by recognizing potential where others saw only ordinary circumstances, and Carlos Martinez had just become her most interesting discovery in years. Saturday morning arrived with unexpected sunshine, and Carlos found himself standing outside Riverside Cafe 15 minutes early. He had changed clothes 3 times, settling on his least stained polo shirt and his only pair of khakis without holes. The cafe was far fancier than anywhere he typically visited, with outdoor seating, artistic coffee cups, and prices that made him wince. Elizabeth was already seated at a corner table when he arrived, looking relaxed in jeans and a simple white blouse. This casual appearance put Carlos more at ease. She seemed like a regular person rather than the intimidating businesswoman from their first meeting. Thank you for coming, Elizabeth said, standing to greet him. I took the liberty of ordering you coffee, black, right? Mrs. Henderson mentioned that's how you drink it. Carlos was touched that she had bothered to find out such a small detail. That's perfect, thank you. As they settled into their seats, Elizabeth pulled out her tablet and showed Carlos several photos that David had taken of the wheelchair modifications. I've been thinking about your work all week. These improvements address problems that our design team has been struggling with for months. Really? Carlos asked, surprised. They seemed like obvious fixes to me. That's exactly why they're so valuable, Elizabeth explained. Sometimes we get so caught up in complex solutions that we miss simple ones. Your cup holder design, for instance. Our engineers have been developing a $40 accessory that does the same thing your 15-cent modification accomplishes. Carlos studied the photos on the tablet. I just used an old soup can and some mounting brackets from work. Anyone could make one. But most people don't see the need or they assume someone else will solve it, Elizabeth said. You saw Mrs. Henderson struggling and took action. That's rare. The conversation flowed naturally as Elizabeth asked about Carlos's background in auto repair and his approach to problem solving. She was genuinely interested in his techniques for diagnosing mechanical problems and adapting solutions from one application to another. Mr. Martinez, Elizabeth said after they had been talking for over an hour, I'd like to make you an offer. Carlos felt his stomach tighten. He had been enjoying the conversation, but now it was getting serious. My company would like to license your wheelchair modifications, Elizabeth continued. We believe they could help thousands of people. License? Carlos repeated, unfamiliar with the term in this context. We would pay you for the rights to use your designs in our products, Elizabeth explained. You would receive an upfront payment plus royalties on every unit we sell. Carlos's mind raced. How much are we talking about? Elizabeth smiled. For the initial licensing fee, I'm prepared to offer you $50,000. The number hit Carlos like a physical blow. $50,000 was more money than he made in 2 years. It would pay off Maria's medical bills, cover Sophia's schooling, and maybe even allow him to expand the garage. Are you serious? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Completely serious, Elizabeth confirmed. And if the products sell as well as I expect, your royalty payments could be substantial. Carlos sat in stunned silence, staring at the tablet screen showing his simple modifications. I need to think about this. Talk to my wife. Of course, Elizabeth said. But there's something else I'd like to discuss. These modifications are impressive, but I think you're capable of much more. She pulled up another screen on her tablet, showing technical drawings of various medical devices. We have several products in development that could benefit from your practical approach to problem solving. Would you be interested in consulting with our design team? I don't know anything about medical equipment, Carlos protested. You know about making things work better, Elizabeth countered. You understand mechanical systems, user needs, and cost-effective solutions. Those skills translate across industries. The consulting arrangement Elizabeth proposed was even more generous than the licensing deal. She wanted Carlos to spend 1 day per week at her facility, reviewing product designs and suggesting improvements. The consulting fee alone would double his annual income. Mrs. Chen, Carlos said, feeling overwhelmed, I appreciate all of this, but I have to ask, why me? Surely you have trained engineers who can do this work? Elizabeth leaned back in her chair, considering how much to reveal. Mr. Martinez, I've been in business for 15 years. I've worked with hundreds of engineers and designers. Most of them are brilliant at solving complex problems, but they often overlook simple solutions. She gestured toward the tablet. Your modifications work because you focused on the user's actual needs, rather than theoretical engineering challenges. That perspective is incredibly valuable. What Elizabeth didn't mention was that she had already run preliminary market analysis on Carlos's designs. Her team estimated that wheelchairs incorporating his modifications could capture a significant share of the mobility device market. The potential revenue was enormous. There's one more thing, Elizabeth added. I'd like you to meet my team next week. See our facility. Understand what we do. No commitments, just an opportunity to explore possibilities. Carlos felt like he was dreaming. A few weeks ago, his biggest concern was paying the electric bill. Now this stranger was offering him life-changing money for modifications he had made in his garage with spare parts. I need to go home and discuss this with Maria, he said finally. Of course, Elizabeth agreed, standing up. Take all the time you need. Here's my direct number. Call me when you're ready. As Carlos walked home, his mind spun with possibilities. The money would solve their immediate financial problems. But the consulting opportunity represented something even more valuable, a chance to use his skills in a completely new way. Maria was in the backyard with Sophia when he arrived, helping their daughter with a science project about simple machines. Carlos watched them for a moment, thinking about how this opportunity could change their lives. How did your meeting go? Maria asked, looking up from the makeshift pulley system they were building. We need to talk, Carlos said, his voice filled with excitement and disbelief. As he explained Elizabeth's offer, Maria's expression changed from curiosity to amazement to concern. $50,000 seemed too good to be true. Carlos, are you sure this is legitimate? Maria asked. People don't just hand out that kind of money for fixing an old wheelchair. Carlos showed her Elizabeth's business card and the photos on his phone that David had taken. She seemed genuine, and Mrs. Henderson trusts her. Sophia looked up from her project. Daddy, does this mean we're rich now? Carlos laughed and hugged his daughter. Not rich, sweetheart, but it means we might not have to worry about money as much. That evening, the Martinez family sat around their kitchen table, carefully considering Elizabeth's proposal. None of them realized they were negotiating with one of the wealthiest women in the country, or that this conversation would mark the beginning of an extraordinary journey. The following Tuesday, Carlos drove his 15-year-old pickup truck through the gates of what he assumed would be a small medical equipment facility. Instead, he found himself on a sprawling campus with gleaming modern buildings, manicured landscaping, and a parking lot filled with luxury cars that cost more than he made in several years. "Are you sure this is the right address?" Maria asked from the passenger seat. She had insisted on coming along, partly out of curiosity and partly to provide moral support. Carlos checked Elizabeth's directions again. This is what she wrote down. The main building was the impressive structure of glass and steel, at least 6 stories high, with medtech innovations displayed in sleek letters across the entrance. Carlos felt a growing sense of unease as they approached the reception area, which looked more like a luxury hotel lobby than anything he had imagined. "Good morning," said the receptionist, a young woman wearing a professional smile and an earpiece. "You must be Mr. Martinez. Ms. Chen is expecting you." The elevator ride to the top floor seemed to last forever. Carlos tugged at his collar, wishing he had worn something nicer than his best button-down shirt and slacks. Maria squeezed his hand reassuringly. "Whatever happens, we'll figure it out together," she whispered. The elevator opened onto an executive floor with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city. Elizabeth's office was at the end of a hallway lined with awards, patents, and photographs of medical devices being used in hospitals around the world. Elizabeth herself was waiting in the doorway, but she looked different from the casual woman Carlos had met at the coffee shop. Today she wore an elegant black suit and carried herself with unmistakable executive authority. The transformation was so dramatic that Carlos wondered if he had somehow gotten involved with the wrong person. "Carlos, Maria," Elizabeth said warmly, though her professional demeanor was now clearly visible. "Thank you both for coming. I hope the drive wasn't too difficult." As they entered her office, Carlos was struck by its size and elegance. The space was larger than his entire garage, with expensive furniture, original artwork, and technology he didn't recognize. Through the massive windows, he could see the company's manufacturing facilities stretching across multiple buildings. "Please, have a seat," Elizabeth said, gesturing toward a conference area with leather chairs arranged around a polished table. "I thought it would be helpful for you to understand more about what we do here before we finalize any agreements." David, the young man who had photographed the wheelchair, entered carrying a presentation folder and the same tablet he had used before. "Mr. Martinez, it's good to see you again." "Before we begin," Elizabeth said, settling into her chair, "I should probably be more transparent about my company's scope." She activated a wall-mounted display that showed MedTech Innovation's financial performance, product lines, and market reach. The numbers were staggering. Annual revenues in the billions, products sold in over 60 countries, research facilities on 3 continents. Carlos felt his mouth go dry as the reality of the situation became clear. This wasn't a small medical equipment company. This was a global corporation. And the woman sitting across from him was obviously far more powerful and wealthy than he had imagined. "I apologize for not being more forthcoming initially," Elizabeth continued. "I've learned that people sometimes react differently when they know about the company's size and success." Maria found her voice first. "Ms. Chen, exactly how big is this company?" "We're the 3rd largest medical device manufacturer in North America," Elizabeth replied matter-of-factly. "I founded the company 17 years ago, and we've grown considerably since then." Carlos struggled to process this information. "And you want to license my wheelchair modifications?" "Actually, I want to do much more than that," Elizabeth said. She nodded to David, who began pulling up detailed market research on the display. "Your modifications address a market segment worth approximately $800 million annually," David explained. "But more importantly, they demonstrate a design philosophy that could revolutionize how we approach mobility devices." Elizabeth leaned forward. "Carlos, I didn't invite you here just to license a few improvements. I want to offer you something much bigger." She paused to let that sink in before continuing. "I'd like you to consider becoming our Director of Practical Innovation." The title meant nothing to Carlos, but Maria's sharp intake of breath suggested it was significant. "What would that involve?" Carlos asked carefully. "Leading a new division focused on real-world problem-solving," Elizabeth explained. "You would have a team of engineers and designers working under your direction, with one goal: making our products work better for actual users." David pulled up an organizational chart showing where Carlos would fit within the company structure. The position reported directly to Elizabeth and came with resources that seemed impossible to believe. The starting salary would be $250,000 annually, Elizabeth continued, plus equity in the company and performance bonuses. Carlos gripped the arms of his chair to keep from falling over. $250,000 was more than 10 times his current income. There would also be a signing bonus of $500,000, Elizabeth added, and full medical coverage for your entire family. Maria began crying quietly, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they were hearing. Carlos felt like he was trapped in someone else's dream. Ms. Chen, he managed to say, I think there's been some kind of mistake. I'm just a mechanic. I don't have a college degree or any formal training in medical equipment. Carlos, Elizabeth said gently, some of our most successful innovations have come from people who think differently about problems. You see solutions that our highly educated engineers miss because you approach challenges from a practical perspective. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the manufacturing facilities below. I built this company by recognizing that technical brilliance isn't always the same as practical effectiveness. Your wheelchair modifications proved you understand that distinction. David showed them photos of the prototype wheelchairs already being manufactured with Carlos's improvements. We've received advance orders for over 10,000 units based on preliminary demonstrations. Elizabeth turned back to face them. Carlos, I'm not offering you this position out of charity. I'm offering it because I believe you can help us build better products and make this company even more successful. The room fell silent as Carlos and Maria tried to absorb everything they had heard. This wasn't just about money, though the financial security would transform their lives. This was about recognition that Carlos's practical skills had real value in a world he had never imagined entering. What would happen to my garage? Carlos asked finally. You could keep it, sell it, or expand it, whatever you prefer, Elizabeth replied. The choice would be entirely yours. Maria wiped her eyes and looked at her husband. Carlos, this is an incredible opportunity. Carlos nodded slowly, still struggling to believe any of this was real. When would you need an answer? Take your time, Elizabeth said. But I hope you'll consider it seriously. I think you'd be surprised by how much you could accomplish here. As they prepared to leave, Elizabeth handed Carlos a detailed offer packet. Everything we discussed is outlined here, including the legal terms and benefit details. During the elevator ride down, Carlos and Maria rode in stunned silence. Their lives had just taken a turn that neither of them could have predicted, and the implications were still sinking in. Carlos, Maria said as they reached the parking garage, I think that woman might actually be a billionaire. Carlos looked back at the impressive building they had just left. I think you might be right. The Martinez family spent 3 sleepless nights discussing Elizabeth's offer. The contract documents spread across their kitchen table painted a picture of opportunities that seemed almost too generous to believe. Carlos read every page multiple times, looking for hidden catches or unrealistic expectations. Maybe we should hire a lawyer, Maria suggested on Thursday evening as they reviewed the benefits package for the 100th time. With what money? Carlos replied, though he was beginning to think legal advice might be worth the expense. Sophia, who had been listening to her parents' conversations with 8-year-old curiosity, finally spoke up. Daddy, why are you scared of something good happening to us? Her innocent question cut straight to the heart of Carlos's concerns. He had spent so many years struggling financially that success seemed foreign and potentially dangerous. What if he failed in this new role? What if Elizabeth discovered he wasn't as capable as she believed? Friday morning brought an unexpected visitor to the garage. Mrs. Henderson arrived in her smoothly functioning wheelchair, accompanied by a distinguished older man in an expensive suit. Carlos. Dear, she said with her usual warm smile, I want you to meet my friend, Judge William Chen. The man stepped forward and extended his hand. Mr. Martinez, I'm Elizabeth's father. Carlos felt his stomach drop. He had been wondering about Elizabeth's background, but meeting her father added a new layer of complexity to an already overwhelming situation. I hope you don't mind the unannounced visit, Judge Chen continued. Elizabeth mentioned that you might have some concerns about her offer. Mrs. Henderson wheeled closer to Carlos. I asked Judge Chen to come talk to you because I could tell you were worried about something. Judge Chen had retired from the federal bench 5 years earlier, after a distinguished career that had earned him respect across the legal community. His presence commanded immediate attention, but his manner was surprisingly gentle. "Mr. Martinez, may I ask what specifically concerns you about my daughter's proposal?" Carlos wiped his hands nervously. "It just seems too good to be true, sir. I keep wondering what I'm missing." Judge Chen chuckled. "That's exactly what Elizabeth hoped you would say." He explained that Elizabeth had built her fortune by identifying people who approached problems with integrity and practical wisdom. She valued character over credentials and had learned to trust her instincts about people. "My daughter doesn't make offers lightly," Judge Chen said. "When she decides someone has value, she's usually right." Mrs. Henderson nodded enthusiastically. "Judge Chen has known Elizabeth since she was a little girl. He can tell you all about her character." Over the next hour, Judge Chen shared stories about Elizabeth's journey from a curious child who took apart medical devices to understand how they worked, to a young entrepreneur who had revolutionized several aspects of medical technology. Her success hadn't come from luck or inheritance. She had earned every dollar through innovation and determination. "Elizabeth told me about your wheelchair modifications," Judge Chen said, examining Mrs. Henderson's chair. "She believes your practical approach could help millions of people. That's not sentiment talking. That's business judgment based on years of experience." As they talked, Carlos began to understand that Elizabeth's offer represented more than just a job opportunity. She was betting on his potential to contribute something unique to her company's mission. "What would you do if you were in my position?" Carlos asked. Judge Chen smiled. "I'd ask myself whether I was more afraid of failure or of missing an opportunity to make a real difference in people's lives." That evening, Carlos called Elizabeth to request one final meeting. They arranged to meet at her office on Saturday morning, when the building would be quieter and they could talk without interruption. Elizabeth was waiting when Carlos arrived, dressed casually in jeans and a sweater. She had prepared coffee and pastries, creating an atmosphere more like a friendly conversation than a business negotiation. "Judge Chen said you had some additional questions," she said, as they settled into her conference area. "Ms. Chen," Carlos began, "I need to understand why you're willing to take such a big risk on someone like me." Elizabeth set down her coffee cup and considered her answer carefully. "Carlos, let me tell you about the first product that made this company successful." She pulled up a presentation showing a simple modification to hospital bed rails that had prevented thousands of patient falls. The design came from a janitor who noticed that patients were struggling with the existing rails. "Our engineers had been working on complex solutions for months, but this man saw a simple fix that worked better than anything we had developed." She clicked to the next slide, showing the financial impact of that single innovation. "That modification generated over $50 million in revenue and established our reputation for user-focused design." "Your wheelchair work reminds me of that breakthrough," Elizabeth continued. "You saw problems that our trained designers missed and solved them with elegant simplicity." Carlos studied the presentation, beginning to understand how his practical experience might actually be valuable in this corporate environment. "There's something else," Elizabeth said. "I've been watching how you handle this opportunity. You've been cautious, thoughtful, and concerned about your family's well-being. Those qualities are exactly what I need in someone who would help guide product
development." She pulled out a folder containing
letters from wheelchair users who had tested prototypes, based on Carlos's modifications. The feedback was overwhelmingly positive, with users describing improvements in comfort, functionality, and daily quality of life. "This isn't about charity or taking a risk on an unproven person," Elizabeth said. "This is about recognizing talent and giving it the resources to flourish." Carlos read through several of the user testimonials, feeling a growing sense of pride and purpose. His simple modifications were already helping people in ways he had never imagined. "Ms. Chen," he said finally, "if I accept this position, what would happen if I don't succeed? What if I can't deliver what you're expecting?" Elizabeth smiled. "Carlos, the only way you could fail is if you stopped caring about making things work better for the people who use them. Based on everything I've seen, that's not going to happen." She stood up and walked to her office safe, returning with a thick document. "I had my lawyers prepare a modified agreement that addresses some concerns you might have." The new contract included provisions that Carlos hadn't expected: a guaranteed minimum employment period, additional family protections, and even a clause allowing him to maintain his garage as a side business if he chose to. "Why would you do all this?" Carlos asked, overwhelmed by her generosity. Because I want you to succeed, Elizabeth replied simply. And because I believe that when you do, everyone benefits, our customers, our company, and your family. Carlos looked at the contract one more time, then at the woman who was offering to transform his life. Mrs. Henderson's broken wheelchair had led to this moment, and he realized that sometimes the most important decisions come disguised as simple acts of kindness. Miss Chen, he said, reaching for a pen, when do I start? 6 months later, Carlos stood in his own office on the 5th floor of MedTech Innovations, watching his team of 12 engineers and designers work on their latest project. The nameplate on his door read, Carlos Martinez, Director of Practical Innovation. But he still sometimes had to pinch himself to believe it was real. The transformation had been remarkable. The signing bonus had eliminated all of Maria's medical debt and allowed them to purchase a comfortable home in a neighborhood with excellent schools for Sophia. But more importantly, Carlos had discovered a passion for his work that went far beyond financial rewards. His first major project had been the wheelchair line based on his original modifications. The Martinez series wheelchairs had become the company's fastest-selling product, with orders backlogged for months. The royalties alone exceeded his previous annual income from the garage. But Elizabeth had been right about his potential for broader innovation. Carlos's practical approach had revolutionized product development across multiple divisions. His team had simplified complex walker designs, improved hospital bed functionality, and developed new approaches to mobility aids that users actually wanted. Carlos, do you have a minute? David appeared in his doorway carrying yet another folder of user feedback. Always, Carlos replied, gesturing toward the chairs around his conference table. David spread out letters and emails from customers who had purchased the new products. The feedback was consistently positive, but one letter in particular caught Carlos's attention. This is from a veteran who lost his leg in Afghanistan, David explained. He says our new prosthetic attachment system has given him back his independence. Carlos read the letter twice, feeling the same satisfaction he had experienced when Mrs. Henderson first tried her repaired wheelchair. The scale was different now. Instead of helping one person, his innovations were improving lives for thousands. But the fundamental motivation remained the same. What's our next project? Carlos asked. Elizabeth wants to see you about that, David replied. She said something about a new challenge that's right up your alley. Carlos found Elizabeth in the research lab examining prototypes of pediatric mobility devices. She had been spending more time in the lab recently, personally overseeing projects that addressed children's needs. Carlos, perfect timing, she said, looking up from a child-sized walker. I want to show you something. She led him to a corner of the lab where several young volunteers were testing adapted playground equipment. Children with various mobility challenges were using swings, slides, and climbing structures that had been modified to be fully accessible. We received a grant to develop inclusive playground equipment, Elizabeth explained. But our current designs are too complex and expensive for most schools and communities. Carlos watched a 7-year-old girl in a wheelchair navigate a ramp system that looked like it belonged in a high-tech laboratory rather than a neighborhood park. The functionality was impressive, but the design was intimidating. What do you think? Elizabeth asked. Carlos walked around the equipment, examining the mechanisms and watching how the children interacted with the various features. His engineering mind immediately began identifying ways to simplify without sacrificing functionality. It works well, he said finally, but it looks like a medical device instead of a toy. Kids want to play, not feel like they're using therapy equipment. Elizabeth smiled. Exactly what I was thinking. How would you approach this differently? Over the next hour, Carlos sketched out concepts that incorporated playground aesthetics with practical accessibility features. Instead of obvious adaptive modifications, his designs integrated accommodations seamlessly into elements that all children would enjoy using. This could be huge, Elizabeth said, reviewing his initial concepts. Playground equipment is a $4 billion market, and almost none of it is truly accessible. As they discussed the project's potential, Carlos reflected on how much his life had changed since that rainy morning when Mrs. Henderson had wheeled into his garage. The scared mechanic who had worried about spending grocery money on wheelchair parts had evolved into someone leading innovation for a major corporation. His phone buzzed with a text from Maria. Sophia's science fair project won first place. She designed an improved crutch tip using principles she learned from watching you work. Carlos smiled, realizing that his influence was extending beyond his professional life. Sophia had been visiting the lab regularly, absorbing lessons about problem-solving and innovation that would shape her own future. Good news? Elizabeth asked, noticing his expression. My daughter just won her science fair with a design improvement, Carlos replied proudly. Like father, like daughter, Elizabeth said. Maybe we'll be offering her a position here in a few years. That evening, the Martinez family celebrated Sophia's victory at their favorite restaurant. As they sat around the table, Carlos thought about the chain of events that had led to this moment. Daddy? Sophia asked between bites of pasta. Mrs. Henderson says you're famous now because of her wheelchair. Not famous, sweetheart, Carlos replied. Just doing work that helps people. Maria reached across the table to squeeze his hand. You've always helped people, Carlos. Now you just have better tools to do it. Later, as they drove home past the old neighborhood where their garage still operated under new management, Carlos pointed out the shop to Sophia. That's where it all started, he said. With Mrs. Henderson's wheelchair? Sophia asked. With kindness, Maria corrected gently. Everything good that's happened started with your father choosing to help someone who needed it. Carlos nodded, understanding now that his success hadn't really begun with Elizabeth's offer, or even with his mechanical skills. It had started with the decision to spend his grocery money on wheelchair parts for an elderly neighbor who couldn't afford proper repairs. The following Monday, Carlos received an email from Mrs. Henderson. She was now using a brand new Martinez series wheelchair, provided by the company as thanks for her role in bringing Carlos and Elizabeth together. The message included a photo of her at a community center, leading a discussion group about aging with dignity. Thank you for fixing my old wheelchair, she had written. But more importantly, thank you for showing me that kindness still matters in this world. Your success gives me hope for the future. Carlos printed the message and added it to the collection of user testimonials that decorated his office wall. Among all the technical achievements and business successes, Mrs. Henderson's simple note remained his most treasured recognition. That afternoon, Elizabeth stopped by his office with news that the playground equipment project had received full funding and approval for nationwide implementation. We'll start with installations in underserved communities, she explained. Places where kids haven't had access to truly inclusive play areas. As Carlos listened to her describe the project's scope and potential impact, he realized that his journey was far from over. Each success created opportunities for even greater contributions, and each innovation opened doors to help more people. The mechanic who had once worried about paying his electric bill was now leading projects that would improve life for children across the country. But at its heart, his story remained the same. It was about seeing problems, caring enough to solve them, and believing that small acts of kindness could create extraordinary change. Mrs. Henderson's broken wheelchair had become the key that unlocked possibilities none of them could have imagined. And Carlos Martinez, the man who fixed things because it was the right thing to do, had discovered that kindness was indeed the most valuable tool in his workshop.